Hello, I'm back. What we're going to do now is learn more about our board. Up next, we're going to continue our tour by talking about more of those little components that I drew on the inside of the board but haven't named yet. So to start with, there are some labels on the board itself. Like right here, it says the word on. And this little thing, what I wrote there is power LED. Apologies for my scratchy handwriting. The power LED is a little power light. LED is short for light emitting diode, which we're going to talk about later. But for now, we'll just call it a light. That will light up, and in this case, this board is a green light, will light up whenever the board has power. It's a very easy, simple, first order debugging thing. Is like, hey, is the board getting power? If that light is on, then it is. If it's not on, then it's not. So what else? There's some more little here, and here. There's some more little LEDs. This one is labeled L. I truly don't know why. There's a little L next to it on the board itself. But what it is an LED attached to pin 13. That is this pin right here, number 13, which is this port, this place to plug things in to the Arduino. So if you're sending electricity out of pin 13, this little LED will light up. If you are not sending electricity out of pin 13, this little LED will be off. So it's basically a small indicator light that is useful. And in our very first programming exercise, we're going to blink that light. Next up, there are these two LEDs here and here, which I will leave unlabeled for the moment. Let's continue our tour. This thing up here, it's a little clicky button. You can click it, and it's I didn't actually draw it. Oops, there you go. That's the reset button. The reset button is the same, pressing the reset button rather, is the same thing as powering off and powering back on the Arduino. So if you want to power it, you can just press the button. You could also unplug it and plug it back in. It will have the same effect. It's not like a computer, this Arduino. It's a microcontroller, and so it doesn't mind cycling. It's not bad for it. It doesn't have some limited number of restarts that you're going to hit by pressing the button too many times. So feel free to press the reset button whenever you want to reset it. And unlike a computer, the Arduino is going to restart in maybe about a second or a little less than a second. You're not going to have to wait a long time. So there's really not a cost in time or effort or like damage to the hardware to doing the restarting. Go ahead and do that as much as you'd like. Now there are these two big things over here, and I'll just continue my tour in a counterclockwise fashion. We'll talk about this thing here. If you were to look at it from the edge up like that, you'd see this is a plug, and it's a specific kind of plug that's going to mate with this. They're going to go like that. This is a USB connection. So this type of plug here and this is a type B USB connection. That's just the label used in the industry for that type of connection. You might have also be familiar with this type of USB. This is type A. So this USB port, well, I'll call it a, yeah, sure, I'll call it a port. That's the physical place where the thing plugs in. Can do two main things that we care about. Number one, allow Arduino to communicate with the computer. So this is how the Arduino is going to talk to your computer and get data back from the computer. It's a two-way communication. And the second thing that port can do is allow computer to power Arduino. So there's actually multiple ways we're going to be able to power an Arduino in general. And the most common, the one we're going to start with at least, is just by plugging it right into the computer through the USB port, because that's really straightforward, really simple, and it'll just get the thing up and running. What else do we need to see? This thing over here is another jack. And this one, it's called a barrel jack. It's so called because it's got that round appearance. So I'll just label it barrel jack. And the barrel jack is a place where you can plug in power to power the Arduino through something that is not the computer. So if you're not plugging something into the USB port, you could plug it instead into the jack. This is DC, that's short for direct current, and we are going to talk about that later when we go over the basics of electronics. DC power in happens right through that port. That is a way to power the Arduino. There's still other ways, but this is another option. And if you are using that port, you're going to want 7 to 12 volts plugged into that thing right there. That's a little funny because the Arduino, this Arduino, is actually a 5-volt device, and yet we're going to be plugging in 7 to 12 volts into that port, which is odd. It turns out there's actually hardware on board, and in the Uno, that hardware is right here. It's this thing with one big leg on the left and 3 smaller legs on the right. That is a voltage regulator. Take a higher amount of voltage and turn it into the 5 volts that the Arduino really needs. And then finally, let's come around to the very bottom of the board. I'm going to tilt the board up, and part of the reason I buy the Elegoo boards is because I like that they have these nice labels on the edge. If I move my hand up here, maybe it'll autofocus better. There we go. So you can see there's labels on the edges of the pins that also correspond to these labels on the actual surface of the board. It's really useful to have both of those labels because if you're plugging something small in from the side, it's like quite clear where it's plugged in. If you're plugging it in from the top and you're kind of looking from the edge, you could have what's called a parallax mistake where you're kind of confused about which way is straight, and you could plug something into the wrong row, which could have bad consequences. So I recommend using those labels on the edge as a guide. So there's a few of them that we're going to care about for now because they're the most important to our current applications. The first one I'm going to care about is this one that's labeled 5V. So I'm just going to draw an arrow to it like this. 5V is what the label says. That's 5-volt connection. That can either give us 5 volts. We might take 5 volts from the Arduino to power some little microcontroller, some other little chip, some tiny little sensor perhaps needs a little bit of power. It needs 5 volts. We can take that from the Arduino and use those 5 volts. Alternatively, we can power the Arduino with 5 volts here. So if you have a 5-volt supply that you know is 5 volts, and this is very important, you can't plug in a higher voltage, for instance, the 7 to 12 volts over here. You can't plug those into the 5V pin or you'll break the Arduino. So if you have a 5-volt supply, you can plug it into 5V and that will turn the Arduino on. It will get power that way. So that's another way to power the Arduino. Finally, the 2 more pins that we're going to in this video are these 2 here, GND and GND. GND is an abbreviation for ground, and I'm going to draw kind of a weird looking double arrow because there are 2 of them. There are 2 ground connections. So the label is GND, which means ground. And what ground means in electrical terms, it's essentially the definition of ground is 0 volts. By the way, you'll notice that when I draw this figure that looks like this, that means the number 0 as opposed to the capital letter O. We would not want to confuse them with each other. So that's what that slash is through that. 0 volts means no electrical potential, no power coming out of there. And why do they give us 2 grounds? It seems a bit redundant. They give us 2 grounds because we need ground all the time in electrical circuits. It's a very common thing to need. So that's a little bit more about the board. In the next video, we'll talk even more. We'll keep going on our tour.